There are a number of myths about people being transformed into monsters. Not surprisingly, many of these are rather sinister tales and more than a little tragic. Lycanthropy is just one of these legendary phenomena, though it is probably the most familiar concept for many people. The prospect of such a radical metamorphosis seems rather far-fetched at first. For humans, perhaps it is. One may hope, at least. Of course, it is a different matter in the insect world. The differences between a caterpillar and a butterfly are obvious enough to begin with. Even outside of these radical changes in life history, there are a number of surprising cases of developmental plasticity. Cases where certain members of a population undergo a metamorphosis into living weapons, with forms often both surprising and grotesque. I speak of the termites, and more particularly the termite soldiers. In the defense of the colony, workers are regularly transformed into creatures with a wide variety of organic weaponry, depending upon the species. So let us take a closer look and see what happens when termites become monsters. Metamorphoses of various sorts are common in the life histories of a great many species on Earth. Perhaps witnessing these frequent alterations of form helped to spark the imaginations of early storytellers as they wove tales of humans turning into monstrous things. Then again, such stories may be more a reflection of human psychology than animal developmental physiology. Regardless, truth may be stranger than fiction, at least in some cases. One such case is found in the eusocial insects, where individual members of a colony will develop into different castes. At minimum, there are the reproductive and worker castes. The functions should be obvious enough from their names. However, there is commonly a further iteration of these castes in the form of the soldiers. These are insects specialized for the defense of the colony, and this specialization is typically reflected in forms that are quite distinct from those of the other castes. Depending upon the species, the changes seen in termite soldiers can be quite striking and severe. The jaws alone can take on a remarkable variety of shapes. The basic set of termite mandibles may be expanded into serrated saws or graceful scythes or sharply curved hooks. They may take on twisted asymmetrical shapes, allowing them to accumulate mechanical forces before releasing them in a devastating impact. Then again, the jaws might be lost altogether to be replaced by far stranger forms of weaponry. Before going into the finer details, we might do well to ask just why such changes happen in the first place. To understand the reasons, one must first understand at least a little bit about termites and their place in the world. The termites hold a relatively unique position as animals that are capable of digesting cellulose. This has granted them access to an abundant and fairly exclusive food source. Some termites specialize in feeding on wood, while others might seek out any available decaying plant matter. Dead grass is a common staple for many tropical species, for example. There are even a number of species that feed on soil, extracting nutrition from whatever rotting remnants of vegetation may be found between the mineral particles. It is worth noting that the termites never dine alone. Depending upon the particular type of termite, they may rely upon the assistance of some variety of fungus or protozoan communities to actually break down their food. The fact that they rely on these various symbionts is more significant than one might at first expect, as it forces the termites into a communal life. Without a colony structure, the necessary symbionts could not be passed on to offspring in the case of lower termites, or properly cultivated in the case of higher termites. To briefly explain the two basic patterns, the lower termites digest cellulose and other polysaccharides with the aid of protozoa and bacteria that dwell mainly in their hindguts. In contrast, the higher termites cultivate fungal gardens, supplying these fungi with dead plant material. The fungus in turn produces edible nodules of tissue that the termites harvest and consume. The result of such associations is twofold. First, all termite species live in colonies of varying sizes. Second, termites are major recyclers of nutrients in terrestrial ecosystems. This is especially true in the tropics, where their collective biomass forms a significant fraction of all animal life in many areas. Inevitably, as a result of this success, there are a number of creatures that have specialized to feed almost exclusively upon termites. There are certain species of ants that regularly raid nearby termite nests and may subsist almost entirely upon these creatures. Even the less specialized ants are generally not averse to consuming termites when the opportunity arises. After all, individual termites are relatively soft-bodied and nutritious by insect standards. Better still, the same nests can be regularly revisited, or rather harvested, without disappearing. The potential of both ants and termites as a food source is significant enough for several mammal species to specialize in raiding their nests. These include such creatures as pangolins, aardvarks, anteaters, and armadillos. Over and over, we see the development of sturdy claws for breaking into nests, long snouts for probing into such breaks, and sticky, extensible tongues for literally lapping up considerable quantities of the resident insects. There are also a few somewhat more unexpected specialists, like the aardwolf, which is more or less what happens when a hyena evolves to feed on termites. An ant raid on a termite nest might be something akin to the alien invasion of a city. The invaders would be creatures with a vague semblance to humans, although they are typically faster and stronger, armor-plated and venomous. This is terrifying enough in its own right, but it pales in comparison to the attack of one of the vertebrate specialists. Here, it is more akin to an alien titan descending upon the city, breaching its outer walls and snatching away countless citizens for a meal. Even the most bloodthirsty kaiju would be hard-pressed to match the menace of such a creature, at least from a termite's point of view. With such terrifying threats as a regular part of life, it is little surprise that the termites must often take extreme measures for survival. This is all the more evident considering the value of the colonies they are trying to protect. Particularly in the higher termites, there is a great deal of work invested in the growth and maintenance of the fungal food source. In fact, the central fungal garden dictates most of the surrounding nest structure. In the process of decomposition, a fungus generates a considerable amount of heat and carbon dioxide. Unless these byproducts are removed, the termites will either cook or suffocate. The towering spires of tropical termite mounds are actually elegant exchange systems for dumping heat and circulating air. In effect, the entire termite mound is continuously inhaling fresh air through various openings lower down, while the hot, stagnant air rises inside the spires to be exhaled nearer to the top. This is only half of the story, though. The fungus requires water as well as food. Thus, the termites excavate tunnels below the mound, sometimes for several meters, to reach the underlying groundwater. There is a continual movement of termites up and down these tunnels, retrieving water from the depths to keep their colony functioning. In addition, foraging tunnels branch out just below the ground in all directions, acting as hidden highways for the regular acquisition of food for the fungus. All of this architecture is reason enough to make the nest a site that cannot be readily abandoned. The fact that the queen of a higher termite colony is a bloated, immobile creature entirely given over to constant egg production only emphasizes this state of affairs. Even in the less extreme termite species, every colony is a valuable resource in need of protection from outside forces. Thus, there is a rather expedient requirement for a defense force in one form or another. So how is this private army raised up exactly? What sort of weird developmental quirks cause some of the resident termite workers to transform into monstrous little soldiers? The answer to this seems to be centered around levels of a substance commonly known as juvenile hormone. In truth, there are a few variants of this particular hormone, but it is sufficient to describe the overall function in terms of a single hormone for our purposes here. In insects, juvenile hormone is present when one larval stage molts into another larval stage. When juvenile hormone is absent during certain critical points in development, the larva molts into a pupa, or the pupa molts into an adult. This is something of an oversimplification, but the essential function should be clear enough. In termites, and more primitive termites in particular, immature workers may undergo various molts to become either sterile adult workers, wingless secondary reproductives, winged reproductives, or soldiers. Very generally speaking, a low level of juvenile hormone throughout the nymphal stage results in a winged reproductive. A low level early on, followed by a rise before molting, leads to a wingless reproductive. A high level early on, that drops to lower levels before molting, results in a worker. A consistently high level of juvenile hormone appears to produce a soldier. The details are more complicated and varied, but this is the general pattern seen in at least some termite species. To put it another way, for whatever reason, the hormone that causes the retention of juvenile developmental traits in other insects is used a little differently in termites. Its absence leads to development into a winged reproductive termite, and that is consistent enough with the pattern seen in insects overall. However, uniquely in termites, its abundance causes the transformation from an immature worker into a monstrous soldier. So what causes the levels of juvenile hormone to remain so high in some termites? Perhaps the colony is under stress and in need of defenders. Maybe there's a little too much of the alarm pheromones circulating around the tunnels. Perhaps there aren't enough soldiers nearby, as their presence does seem to inhibit the formation of additional soldiers. Whatever the root causes, sooner or later, soldiers will arise within typical termite colonies. Such a developmental pathway tends to be a rather grim commitment for the little insect. While one does occasionally see the development of reproductive termites with soldier features in certain circumstances, this is largely confined to more primitive termite groups. In the vast majority of cases, soldiers are sterile. Furthermore, they cannot effectively function as workers, as their mouthparts have been massively modified. Typically, soldiers cannot even feed themselves and must rely upon their nestmates for regular feeding. Once a termite has molted into a soldier, it will never be able to become a worker again. It is a soldier for the rest of its life, and its primary function is to defend the colony, and often die in the process. So now, with all of this in mind, let us consider just what kind of soldiers may develop among the various termite species. The simplest and most direct form of development is an expansion of the mandibles in the head. This is often seen in more primitive groups, like the genera Neotermes or Zoetermopsis. In such cases, the jaws grow longer and thicker, with similar serrations to what one finds in the worker's jaws, just on a larger scale. The jaws also become significantly darker. This darkening is a side effect of the hardening process in insect exoskeletons. Setting additional coloration aside, if an insect exoskeletal structure is darker, it generally means that it is also tougher. The head similarly expands and often becomes darker as well, as the exoskeleton here is also toughened. This is not to accommodate a larger brain. Rather, it is to hold significantly larger muscles for operating the enlarged mandibles. In some extreme cases, like the soldiers of certain species of macrotermes, the head may be at least as large as the rest of the body. The bite force generated by such a gathering of muscles is quite significant. To carry around all of that extra weight, the soldier termite's legs are often at least somewhat thickened and toughened as well. The body may similarly be enhanced, though not to nearly the same degree as the head. The second sort of soldier is something of a refinement of the first. The enlarged mandibles and head are still present, but the mandibles have a more altered shape. The serrations are largely absent, and the jaws have become a pair of slicing blades capable of severing the limbs of invading insects. One can see this pattern in many species of Reticulotermes. In the closely related genus Coptotermes, these sabers are enhanced by the addition of a frontal gland. This gland empties through a pore on the front of the head just above the jaws, and the gland itself occupies a considerable amount of the soldier's body. It produces a sticky sort of glue, which tends to bind invading insects, making them easier to destroy. Of course, the soldier sometimes gets caught up in its own glue trap as well, but these are acceptable losses so long as the colony is adequately defended. In the genus Rhynchotermes, the opening of this frontal gland is extended forward into a long, thin snout. The toxic contents of the gland can be applied to enemies without the soldier becoming ensnared quite so easily. The soldier mandibles in this genus tend to resemble a pair of wickedly curved fish hooks and may be used to discourage the larger vertebrate predators. In the genus Termites, the frontal gland is even further developed, while the mandibles are atrophied to virtually nothing. In contrast to what is found in most termite species, these soldiers are often a little smaller and more slender than the workers, and the heads are not quite so overgrown. However, the soldiers are still quite easy to distinguish from the workers. Their heads have a very distinctive shape with a pointed snout. The overall outline resembles a teardrop from above. These Nazoot soldiers are capable of spraying the contents of their frontal glands over a considerable distance, ensnaring and entangling would-be invaders. Furthermore, since this sticky material contains a number of rather toxic volatile chemicals, it tends to dissuade larger vertebrates as well. It is interesting to note that although these soldiers are blind, as with other termite species, they are still quite accurate in their little artillery strikes. One might suppose that they have a sophisticated sense for detecting nearby vibrations, or perhaps air currents or chemical cues, to allow them to accurately deliver their noxious sprays. The termite workers in this genus often forage out in the open, with Nazoot soldiers taking up guard positions on either side of the columns of foraging workers. This decidedly bold strategy should give some indication of just how effective these jawless soldiers are. Even so, most termite species have soldiers with quite pronounced mandibles, and the saws and sabers already mentioned are merely the beginning as far as forms are concerned. Sometimes the jaws are capable of pressing together to gather force, then snapping past one another to explosively release this force all at once. It is not too dissimilar to the way a person might snap their fingers. As a common result of this sudden energy release, enemy insects can often be thrown a considerable distance away from the soldier, and may have a few dents put into their exoskeletons. In some cases, these snapping jaws are more or less symmetrical. This is a pattern seen in Termes panamensis, for example. Perhaps more interesting are the asymmetrical jaws, where one mandible is very differently shaped to its counterpart. These soldiers look quite twisted in a rather literal sense, but these twisting jaws are capable of generating even greater force when they snap. The soldiers of Paracaprotermes natobii in particular have been studied, and their jaws produce some of the most rapid and forceful motions seen in the insect world. As impressive as such weapons may be, we should recall that the main function of the termite soldier is the defense of the colony. Sometimes the best defense may well be a good offense, but other times it is simply a solid defense. This is exemplified in the phragmotic pattern of termite soldier seen in the genus Cryptotermes. These soldiers have rather small jaws, at least by termite soldier standards. Their heads aren't especially large, though they are greatly modified. The heads are roughly cylindrical, with a flattened, porous surface at the front. The heads are also remarkably darkened, indicating a considerable level of hardening in the exoskeleton. As one might guess from such a form, these soldiers are effectively living corks. They use their own armored heads to block up vital passages within the nest, denying entry to invading insects. All a prospective invader encounters is a hardened patch of highly armored exoskeleton blocking up a potential entrance. It is worth noting that such phragmotic soldiers are also seen in a few species of ants, an intriguing case of convergent evolution, as ants and termites are not closely related to one another. Self-sacrifice in the defense of the colony is a part of any termite soldier's job, but this is taken to extremes in a few cases. For example, in Globotermes sulphureus, the soldiers will literally rupture themselves in the line of duty. This phenomenon is technically known as autothesis, which roughly translates into self-sacrifice. The frontal glands in these soldiers are quite large, occupying a considerable portion of the body's interior. When the soldier essentially explodes, the toxic adhesive contents of the frontal gland are spread out over the immediate area. If the resulting mess entangles a couple of enemy invaders, this is apparently an acceptable trade for the colony. Sometimes this autothesis is undertaken by workers rather than soldiers. In fact, it is not uncommon in the relatively few species of soldierless termite. However, this phenomenon probably reaches its peak in another termite species that has fairly standard if somewhat rare soldiers and exploding workers. Neocapritermes terracua is a species within the family Termitidae, the higher termites. As the workers in this species age, they slowly accumulate crystals of copper-containing enzymes in a pair of specific spots on their abdomens. These accumulations can be seen as two blue-green spots on the back just behind the thorax. When these workers rupture their bodies, these enzymes are released and combined with secretions produced by the salivary glands. These specific enzymes convert relatively non-toxic precursor chemicals into considerably more toxic substances. The result is a brew that would be lethal to the termite, if not for the fact that the creature has already essentially killed itself anyway. Until these components are combined, though, the termite remains quite unaffected by them. It is interesting to note that the oldest workers have the largest accumulations of these enzymes, and are the most prone to autothesis. There is a certain sense to this. After all, these older workers are essentially worn out from age and fairly close to death by simple wear and tear. Thus, it is perhaps less tragic when they go out in a blaze of blue-green, sticky, toxic glory, as they were not far off from dying regardless. All of these various types of soldiers, and the sometimes extreme adaptations of even the workers, serve to illustrate the severity of the measures termites will undertake to defend their homes and their siblings. While their visages may indeed be monstrous to behold, their actions and purpose are considerably less so. In the end, they are not all that similar to the bestial lycanthropes of legend. Instead, they are perhaps more like armored knights defending their castles and kingdoms from the depredations of a world filled with dragons. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Until next time.